Greetings. One of the neat aspects of living near the coast is the unusual ebb and flow of the waters. Today we'll talk a little bit about king tides, which are the highest tides of the year, and they happen about 2 or 3 times throughout the year, and they're a little bit different than what we call spring tides, which are high monthly tides. We'll also talk about the effects of tropical storms. Of course, we could all think about this in the analogy of global sea level rise and the whole idea of climate change and how it'll affect this very dynamic environment. Even if you don't live near the coast, you might wonder, well, why is this relevant? What's the big issue here? And we'll address some of those things later. But then you might think, why would anybody want to live near this very dynamic environment?
Me too.
What do you know, kid?
See, an ordinary person spends his life avoiding tense situations. Repo man spends his life getting into tense situations.
Then we followed up with Lonesome and Michael.
Let's go get a drink.
As many of you folks know, that the tides are created by the gravitational attraction of the moon, and to a lesser extent that of the sun. Of course, with Earth's spinning on its axis, it intersects these areas of high tides created by the lunar attraction and low tides that are perpendicular to that. So during a lunar month, we'll have two high tides, and they coincide with the new moon and the full moon. And that's because of the position of the moon relative to the sun, with the new moon it being towards the sun and with the full moon being opposite of the sun. It accentuates this bulge, and we get our highest tides for the month. So here I'll show you some tide charts and for the area, and what we see here is our tide charts typically range about 4 to 6 feet. Again, we have our high tides, spring tides twice the month, and then we also have an intersecting lower tide range, and that's called a neap tide, and that's when the moon is perpendicular to the direction of the sun. This is our king tide chart, and we get our king tides in the winter time. The reason for that being is we have our highest tides in the winter because the Earth's proximity to the sun is closest. Yeah, we're closer to the sun in the northern hemisphere winter than we are at any other time of year, and that little extra closeness to the sun causes us to get these really high tide. Now the king tide around here ranges up to about 9.5 feet, so that's 9.5 feet. Where normally it might go up to about 6 feet, here we have this extra 3 feet or so. A little bit unusual, and in part it's really kind of high tide ranges due to the unusual geography we have in the area. Most king tides tend not to go up 9 feet above the low tide mark. So being in the south part of the Los Angeles basin, our geography is defined by deltaic deposits created by the outflow of the Los Angeles River, the San Gabriel River, and to a lesser extent the Santa Ana River. And they formed a large delta in this area. No, not as big as, say, the Mississippi River or, say, the Nile River, but still it's deltaic deposits. And it's these delta deposits that are responsible for Long Beach's long history with oil production. The big reason why these deltaic deposits are important is they're fairly broad, so they head out in the Pacific Ocean many miles, and they're also relatively shallow. Well, I mean, our depth around here is typically around 60 to 100, 120 feet or so. And this causes the inertia of the tides to ramp up and, so to speak, surge into this area locally. We'll see some of the videos of these effects as it comes up. So it kind of accentuates the condition of these high tides. So as you can see in these pictures here, that mitigation is very minimal on this. If anything, it causes what we call nuisance flooding and such, which is very minor and localized. Infrastructure is developed around this high tide range and such, so everything's all okay, and there's even a little bit of fudge room on some of these. Now, where some of the problems do exist is some of the older infrastructure that may not have accounted for some of these. And I hate to say this, but often that involves things like roads and such, which tend to be the lowest point. There are pump stations and stuff to help deal with some of the small flooding and stuff. But overall, it's not too bad. It's to be expected, very predictable and such. One of the important aspects of monitoring these king tides is not only for researchers but also decision makers. What we see is that with the idea of global sea level rise associated with climate change, that we may have profound effects in the future. And of course, this leads to money. Who pays for this stuff? Of course, we see a lot of private infrastructure development, but then we also have to think of municipalities and ideas of coastal flooding. Again, it's part of living in this fairly intense, dynamic environment. With our king tides occurring during the winter, what we tend to see is that winter storms may have ramifications associated with this coastal erosion and coastal flooding. We also have to consider the impact to insurance companies. Insurance covering property, both civil and municipal, associated with conditions that it might associate with flooding and such. Hence, we have these FEMA flood maps and such. Well, recently we had a hurricane kind of approaching the area, and it decreased to a tropical storm. Unfortunately, this kind of coincided with our spring tides of the month, so we're going to get a high tide, and we're also going to have this tropical depression coming up. Now, one of the concerns with tropical depressions is that they create low pressure. And low pressure is when the air density over a given area is below average. And believe it or not, that tends to pull the water up, actually causes a local rise in sea level. Also, here in California, we have relatively cold water. Now, with an influx of warm water, this actually accentuates sea level because warm water, because it's warm, is expanded a little bit more. So now we have a scenario of a high tide, we have low pressure, and we have warm water. Also, with the winds associated with the tropical storm, it brings on big surf. So this started some concern with local flooding and impact in this coastal region. So this was pretty interesting. So I was working at the marina as the storm approached, and for the most part I didn't give it much thought. Looking at the bay and such, things tended to be fairly normal, so to speak. But then I got a phone call from a neighbor who's actually out of town. And he said that he saw some news reports, and lo and behold, I decided to go home and mobilize. And on my way home, what I saw was all the emergency services activated. My first thought was, wow, is this really going to be that bad? Surf wasn't going to be called to be too high, usually somewhere around the 4 to 6 foot range in most areas and south-facing beaches and such. But I thought to myself, hey, this is a good exercise to activate emergency services and public works and get them coordinating in an event. And I guess it's better to be safe than sorry. I mean, during a disaster, there's two types of people. Those are people who are part of the problem, and those are part of the solution. So I thought, hey, this is a good opportunity to check out my emergency preparedness and make sure I had my bug out bag, and also make sure my plan was in order. Now, of course, high tide wasn't supposed to hit until about 10 o'clock that night, so we had a few hours before it actually hit. And away we go. One can see the amount of effort that the public works are doing to berm up and prevent coastal erosion happening because of the expected surf that was going to happen. We see that they're probably expending quite a bit of money, but when you kind of consider what insurance would have to cover and infrastructure loss and personal property loss, it kind of makes sense. I mean, there's several hundred houses in this area, and the cost of a couple of these houses would cover kind of the mitigation efforts. So again, what we see is that there's a lot of effort that's kind of put in this, and it's good for the short-term effects. Again, in the long term, we have to kind of question that, and what are some of the long-term goals for trying to mitigate potential sea level rise and maybe even increase storm frequency. I will say it's pretty amazing to see these 12-foot high sand berms up along the beach and such. And most of them did erode away during the whole event. So even though it seems very temporary, Hey man, it's like building a sandcastle on the beach. You build a little moat around it and it helps protect things. So a little bit of effort really went a long way. Kudos to the city and emergency services for really kind of getting their top-notch, on-point game going to protect these properties and to activate emergency services. So as high tide approached at 10 o'clock that night, everybody was all kind of prepared to see what was going to go on. Of course, I went out to see what was going on. Emergency services were way out there. It's actually a bunch of the residents out there. It was closed to non-local areas. It was fun to visit some of the areas that I had seen during the king tides and to see kind of the analogy associated with this. And at least on the bay side, where we really didn't have to deal with surf and such, what I saw, even though this was in September, not a king tide season, we did have our big spring tide, which was only about 7 feet or so. And what I saw is with the storm surge, it kind of equated to about king tide levels. So again, it shows where the king tides are really useful in looking at coastal mitigation and such, and how we could maybe prepare for the future and associated with sea level rise and maybe increased storm frequency. Of course, on the surf side, we saw a lot more impact associated with that. And again, there might be some long-term effects and planning associated with that. It's always nice to see the effects of these tidal ranges and such, especially here at high tide for the analogy of sea level rise. But also it's really neat to look at low tide, and I'll show that for maybe another video where you can actually see underwater structures and such. So it was neat to revisit some of these areas that I've seen at king tide and then subsequent with the storm surge that we had. So with the storm's aftermath, what we see is that very little damage was done. Emergency services were right on point with everything. It was really neat to go walk the beach afterwards. A couple of things. One is we had fairly high surf, especially for being within a area surrounded by breakwater. We did get the 4 to 6 foot surf, and it was neat to see some of the coastal erosion that took place and some of these old pier pylons that had eroded out, and we could actually see on the beach now. The other really exciting thing is surfers. We get to see surfers here. Now, of course, Long Beach was famous back before breakwater days for a surfing location, but it's these unusual events that actually opened it up and we got to see surfers again. So kudos on that. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know I learned a lot researching the material and going back and looking at my observations and stuff. So I hope all of you have a great day. Bye-bye.